very warm welcome to our afternoon session at this Humanitarian Congress in Berlin. Welcome to our panel discussion on decisions on the edge, handling dilemmas concerning the fundamental principles. I'm glad to be your host today and for this important session. And I think we got a really good introduction this morning during the opening session. For the ones who were here, for the ones who were not here, you can maybe listen to it online because I think it was really exciting and kickstarting somehow the discussion. My name is Alexandra Rüth. I'm heading the Knowledge and Innovation Department of German Red Cross, International Cooperation, and just a short introduction what you can expect from this session today. So we try to be brief in terms of discussing here on the panel. So we are set for an engaging 1 hour long discussion, and then it will be followed by a 30 minutes Q&A session. And I really would like to invite you to think about your questions and your comments. It's extremely valuable for us to get your inputs as well. And so warm welcome to you here on site, but as well to the audience following us from the screens from at home virtually. And since this is something we often forget, I want to say thank you to Julia von Stülpnagel, my colleague, who really prepared this session and did the biggest part in preparing the session. So mine is only a minor one. So big thanks to you. I invite you as well to use social media, the hashtag HCBerlin. I think it's, yeah, you can see it as well on the screen here. So why this topic? Why the focus on decisions on the edge and the dilemmas we face around the humanitarian principles? And I think this morning a lot of different aspects were already mentioned, but let's just in the beginning of the session take some time to again think about it. So the humanitarian principle, humanity, impartiality, neutrality, and independence are supposed to be or are our ethical cornerstones that are supposed to guide our work of all the humanitarian organizations globally. And they were adopted in the International Conference in Vienna in 1965. So the principles theoretically ensure that aid is delivered solely based on needs without discrimination or political bias, and that we, all the humanitarian actors, remain neutral and independent from external pressures. And then there is the international humanitarian law, which should provide the legal framework for protecting civilians and non-combatants during armed conflict. And all that is somehow our framework that we are working in. It's the theoretical framework as we somehow could feel this morning, and the reality somehow is different. And I think we are all aware of that. There is an erosion of the humanitarian principle, and that means that we have to navigate as humanitarian actors these ethical complexities. We have to reflect within our own organizations. Then there are aspects like the climate crisis. It's somehow on top. It's challenging us in a different way, and there is, for example, Hugo Slim. He's here at the conference as well, and he will do the closing tomorrow. So he's challenging us with the climate crisis. Do we have a moral obligation to respond proactively to climate change, which he sees as a deeply ethical issue? Then there are agenda of powerful states. And I think we are here in Germany, and Germany has as well, is a powerful state and has agendas. And humanitarianism is intertwined with those agenda of powerful states. And this is raising questions about neutrality and impartiality. And just a short remark, so tomorrow is a panel on humanitarianism in the shades of politics, which I recommend to all of you as well. Then there's a question of access to aid. So we all know that war tactics severely limit humanitarian access, and that they have increasingly been used as tools of war, putting millions at risk. And we have the international humanitarian law, which prohibits the starvation of civilians, but the law enforcement is inconsistent. And I mean, I can name some contexts: Gaza, Ukraine, Myanmar, and others. And there's the big question of funding. So many at-risk groups are not prioritized, and that is due to funding constraint and political challenges within international organizations. The list is not complete. There are as well new players playing important roles: China, Turkey, United Arab Emirates, and those are only examples. So that is a bit the situation we are facing. What can you expect from the panel today? We will have a first block where we discuss again the dilemmas. So what are the dilemmas we are facing, how to deal with them, and are the principles still the framework we need? Then we will move, because somehow, I mean, we can discuss about all the challenges in the world, but somehow we have to move as well to our own role. So we will discuss in the second part the more organizational perspectives. So what can we do within our organizations? How can we as individuals maybe start small changes? And at the end, we will finalize here with our panelists. We will send some messages to the powerful actors. And then followed by a Q&A. And what is really to my heart is not to forget that this is often very theoretical discussions. We are in conferences. We are all coming mostly from, our desks in Berlin, in the big cities in the global north. And I really want us to not forget about people in need and about the human aspects of our work. So now it was a lot of time me talking, but now it's finally time to introduce our great panelists who will inspire us today with their insights. They bring a lot to this conference with their experience, and we have Dr. Andrea Steinke sitting next to me. She's an independent researcher and consultant working a lot on humanitarian strategic questions, and now focusing on decision-making and process design with her new enterprise, Egilstein, and she's also a research associate at the Center for Humanitarian Action. Then we have Nimo Hassan. Nimo was today already in the opening session. Nimo is the director of a big Somali NGO consortium or platform. She will explain about it later, and has a wide range of experience in senior leadership roles and on executive boards. She held positions with CARE International, Africa Trust, Education Trust, and is currently the chair of the board of ICWA, a global humanitarian network. We have Professor Marco Sassòli with us. He's professor of international law at the University of Geneva. Was as well a special advisor to the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and is a former ICRC staff member. He was the chair of the board of the Geneva Call, so an NGO that promotes respect for humanitarian norms among armed non-state actors. And last but not least, we have Abby Stoddard with us, a partner at Humanitarian Outcomes, specializing in humanitarian policy and aid in conflict zones. She's an expert on the safety of aid workers and has authored really influential reports on the humanitarian system and humanitarian operations. So since these introductions by the host of a session is often very theoretic, I give the word now to our panelists to introduce themselves using one question. In your professional journey, when have you felt the most significant dilemmas concerning the fundamental principles? Can you recall a moment when you faced decisions on the edge? And I think it would really be good to be, I mean, we all know we don't want to sit here, you know, I'm working for German Red Cross and be super open and transparent about all failures, but sometimes it's really important to make a change, to be as transparent as we can about the challenges we face in our day-to-day work. Andrea, over to you.
Thank you, Alexandra. Also, thank you to you and your team for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and an honor to be here, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion and taking things forward. I thought of 3 examples that I'm going to present in a very brief and flashlighty ways. Disclaimer first, as you have said, I'm a researcher, anthropologist by training, so I have not been involved in direct operational decision making, but I have researched, analyzed, and later consulted organizations in their decision making. And the first thing that comes to my mind is where my humanitarian research career started. It was in Haiti after the earthquake 2010. You recall there was a massive level of destruction of infrastructure, massive loss of life, and despite the fact that there was a huge amount of money and resources flowing into the country, it barely trickled down to those who needed it. And I was looking at an organization who was rebuilding houses, and there I realized that the purpose of humanitarian action is to reestablish the status quo as imperfect, as unequal, and as inhumane it was before. So that really struck me in a way, and I was in trouble to relate and connect that to an idea of humanity, of your own humanity as a humanitarian worker, but also of the humanity of those that you are trying to support. So that was the first reality check with the humanitarian principles. The second one is fairly recent. It has been discussed here. We are here in Berlin. The German government has recently decided to reduce the humanitarian budget by half, and not only that, but also identify priority areas where to work in the future, and had made it abundantly clear that they will focus on those areas that have a relationship to the problems of Europe. So that bears the question, how does that relate to the principle of impartiality and based on need alone? Based on need alone when it serves our purposes. So that's the second thing. The third thing, very briefly, is the subordination of humanitarian considerations and concerns to other areas of politics, economy, and decision making that I think we especially see in Gaza today, and that kind of interferes with the principle of independence. And I think about this a lot, and I hope you are too, and I'm sure you are too.
Thank you, Andrea, and directly over to Nimo.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. A very difficult question, I think, especially in the current context, when powerful states and governments are disregarding these values. Then how do you expect the locals to respect that? I think or how do you push the principle response in the context that you're working in? I want to maybe give an example of a positive impact of an experience that I had. So maybe just a quick question, a quick information on the work that I do and I'm involved in. The Somali NGO Consortium is an NGO platform, and it's a mixed fora for international and locals as well. So. And we do advocacy, representation, and coordination among the NGOs, among the members, but also across the sector. Yeah, the dilemma I want to share with you is, we don't deliver directly at the fora, but we have a lot of members who are. So one dilemma that I faced recently is advising a member of NGO consortia who was under immense pressure to align with specific political functions during a particular conflict in Somalia. This challenge really tested our dedication to the core humanitarian principle of neutrality and impartiality that are essential when navigating and working in these complex environments, but also complex local authorities in a volatile environment. One critical moment occurred when the organization, that particular organization, considered suspending its operations in a conflict zone to avoid perceptions of taking sides, which means they were planning to halt the aid, which meant abandoning thousands of vulnerable individuals who relied on the NGO for essential services such as food, medical care, and shelter. This was really a decision on the edge, where the risk of being perceived as politically aligned clashed directly with the commitment to serve the communities in need, regardless of their affiliation and political landscape. So we advise the NGO to remain operational, but with a reinforced emphasis on impartiality. This involved developing a robust communication strategy that made the humanitarian mission very clear to both the local authorities and the communities that we were serving. Organize public statements and meetings, and ensuring that there's more visibility and transparency on the process on the ground. For example, ensuring that aid distribution was equitable as possible. I'm describing an ideal situation, but honestly, I think when you put your heads together and put the communities in need at the forefront, I think we'll always find a way to navigate through these challenges. So this is these dilemmas are is experienced on a day-to-day basis on those who are on the front lines, and reputational risks is quite high, and this is where I think supporting and working with the local actors, regardless of which side of the equation they sit, is really important. So adhering to these dilemmas requires more than what's on paper. It demands decisive action, clear communication, and willingness to take the difficult choices to safeguard your humanitarian position and the ability to respond to those in need. Yeah, I'll stop here, but thanks.
Thank you, Nimo. Over to you, Marco.
Yeah, thank you. Obviously, I will not speak of the dilemmas of a professor, but of a humanitarian. There are dilemmas. But of a humanitarian, so I start in the last century, and I hope I don't violate my confidentiality obligations to the ICSC in Bosnia. When I was protection coordinator, you all know that the Bosniak Muslim population was under very strong pressure by the Bosnian Serbs, and we analyzed that for some of these people that was life-threatening, and there was a possibility, and somehow the Bosnian Serbs were happy with that we evacuate some people from some places. And this is obviously a serious dilemma because you contribute to ethnic cleansing. But on the other hand, if your analysis is that anyway, if you don't contribute, not all these people will die, but some of them will die and a lot will have a very bad time. And so the solution was we evacuated, and simply I, as a lawyer, I obtained that the Bosnian Serbs gave everyone a document that if they want, after the conflict, they can come back. If the Palestinians had got such a document in 1948, perhaps this would slightly change their situation, but it's a formalistic solution. Sorry that even as a humanitarian, I was already a lawyer. And the second one is a more operational dilemma. More recently, as was mentioned, I was chairing the board of Geneva Coal, and at that time, Geneva Coal was only in Geneva, and it was from Geneva that we made missions to different countries where armed groups were active, trying to engage those armed groups to undertake to comply with humanitarian rules, and then following up, but we had no permanent field presence. And then the discussion came up in the board whether we should have a permanent field presence. And this has disadvantages and advantages. The disadvantage is, especially if you work with armed groups, if you have a permanent field presence, you have to deal with the government, and you are somehow controlled by the government, and security concerns are much greater if you are permanently there, and at least in my view also, it's more expensive if you are there. On the other hand, there is, as you all know, a pressure for localization. If you are present in the field, you can have more permanent contact, and it is true also the donors give much more easily money to pay someone who is somewhere in the field than someone who is in Geneva, even if you explain that with armed groups. This is different, and so the board finally decided that we decentralize.
Thank you. Nice to be with you. I'm glad I'm not the only one that has to go back to the last century for my personal example, but I was last in an operational NGO running programs 25 years ago. So mine was also in the Balkans. I was in Kosovo. Our organization was running a tuberculosis control program in a conflict-affected environment with very sensitive and problematic relations with the local authorities. Now, in our work to try to build acceptance and ingratiate ourselves with the authorities and make sure that we maintained access to the patient population, we found ourselves in a situation where it somehow tipped into expectations and demands for concessions of various sorts. So it was kind of a slow onset dilemma where we realized we were faced with a choice between essentially bribing the local health authorities to maintain access to the patients, which not only violates humanitarian principles, but makes it more difficult for all the other NGOs in the area because they could be similarly extorted. Or, on the other hand, losing access to the patients, which if you know TB, you have to monitor treatment for the full course, and if treatment is interrupted, you run the risk of TB-resistant, drug-resistant strains of the disease, which is not only terrible for the individuals, but is a real public health threat. So I wish I could claim that we came to a very deliberative, considered decision one way or the other, but events overtook us and there was the mass displacement and we ended up losing access to those people anyway. But what I've come to know in my many years of doing research and consultations on humanitarian action is that that particular dilemma, the one of paying for access, is probably the most common and mundane of all the humanitarian dilemmas. I think all organizations face it someplace nearly every day.
Thanks a lot. I will even not try to summarize. I think you all are aware that, I mean, the very different positions, we all face dilemmas on a daily basis, and they all have impacts on our work, they have impacts on, it's about decision making, it's really very different aspects. We will now come back to the more theoretical part around the dilemmas, and we will start now with Abby again. And I would kindly ask you to reduce your statement to 3 to 4 minutes because we are a bit over time already.
Just make this sign.
Yeah, no.
So the question was, are the principals increasingly under pressure? Is that right? So I think there are two parts to that. There are the actions and behaviors of the combatants in the current conflicts, and the reactions of the humanitarians as a response to these situations. Now, if the question is, are the combatants increasingly violating the norms and principles of IHL in these conflicts, I think there's no question that that's true. Humanitarian action is meant to be protected and facilitated, and we see every day it's being impeded and imperiled. So this is not just kind of the vibe that we're getting. It's the direct experience of organizations trying to work in these places. It's a function of the scale and intensity of the conflicts that we're seeing. And it's also very clearly reflected in the data. So you have aid worker fatalities, which were hovering around 100 a year 5 years ago, have more than doubled now. You have greater numbers of direct attacks on hospitals, humanitarian facilities, and humanitarian convoys. And as someone who's been working with this data, I can tell you that what used to be fairly rare and shocking is now increasingly common. And with the lack of accountability after each one of these, it becomes more liable to happen again. So like, how many times can you contravene a norm before it ceases to be a norm? And there's the crisis of confidence in deconfliction efforts, and you see more and more humanitarians opting out of the humanitarian notification system because they don't think their military counterparts are acting in good faith. So I think most humanitarian dilemmas boil down into either questions and problems of complicity or problems of coverage, specifically impartial coverage. So you're getting instead very skewed and partial coverage. So by being there at all, for instance, by, in Marco's example, potentially being complicit in the ethnic cleansing, or by working in Myanmar, but only in the places where the junta says you're allowed to work in these designated aid areas and not outside where the needs might be greater. Are we being complicit in a moral wrong or an oppression of the people? And then even if an organization is being as principled as it can be in its own operations, collectively, we are leaving gaps. Is there a collective violation of the principle of impartiality to the extent that organizations cluster where they can work, where it's safer, where it's easier, and where there are greater needs in different parts where there's very sparse coverage? I'll leave it there.
Thanks a lot, Abi. And I think maybe Nimo, you can have some answers to the questions as well Abi raised. In your daily work in leading this large NGO consortium in Somalia, how do you see the humanitarian principles at play, and where do you see dilemmas? Do you have some specific examples, and how do you navigate those dilemmas in such complex environment?
Thank you. It's a challenge to deliver aid in such a difficult humanitarian aid in such a difficult context, and then on top of that, trying to deliver more principled humanitarian response is even more difficult, and I think it's something that we confront on an individual basis, but also on an organization. So a forum like the Somali NGO Consortium, you get to hear stories of how particular NGOs are having problems. And I think one of the big ones, as Abi mentioned earlier, is access and maintaining access to communities. When you have warrant non-state actors, but you have governments that are weak in terms of institutions who maybe do not understand or disregard those principles. And I think it's really important to maintain, even if it's very difficult for us to maintain a principled response because of the principle conditionalities attached to the aid itself, and the governments or the powerful governments that the donors or states who respond are not sticking to these principles. But we do have to navigate it and ensure that we're accessing communities, whether it's addressing bureaucratic impediments with the government, whether it's constantly having a conversation and explaining your position, redefining, representing yourself to the same authority or the same community on what your purpose is and what you're trying to present, that you require unimpeded access to address certain conflicts. For example, now there's a lot of prioritization that's happening because of the funding, and one example that I can share with you is the challenge in addressing the drought, the recent drought in Somalia, where you have communities who are recently displaced because of the drought, but then you have host communities which are vulnerable and fragile and need the same support. How do you reconcile that? How do you ensure that you're not exacerbating an already inequalities within these communities? So navigating it is very difficult, but you have to do that. This is your job. This is the only way you can deliver. You have to be seen, not to be biased. So I think perception is really as important as the way you want to deliver as well. So for you to exist, for you to have access, for you to deliver, you need to play that role a lot more prominent so that at least you have a community buy-in and you have the community access.
Thanks a lot for bringing this really on-the-ground perspective to this discussion, which I think is extremely important. We will now move a bit more to the IHL perspective, and I'm asking Marco to give your perspective in your former role as a professor of IHL. How do you see the principles in today's world? And if you, I know it's a big question, but if you can connect a bit to the IHL and maybe the challenges you see.
Yeah, thank you. In one word, don't expect too much from IHL and from humanitarian principles when there are dilemmas, because there are always, or nearly always, dilemmas where two principles oppose each other and the principles don't say which has a priority. Now, if we start from humanitarian law, and I'm sorry if I am provocative and honest with you, be conscious that humanitarian law is addressed to states and to armed groups and somehow to individuals who fight armed conflicts, and therefore humanitarian dilemmas outside armed conflicts are not governed by humanitarian law. But even in armed conflict, humanitarian organizations are not, with very little exceptions, especially medical assistance, are not addressed by humanitarian law addressees. They don't have obligations under humanitarian law. It is only indirectly that humanitarian law deals with them. For instance, humanitarian organizations have a certain right of access if they comply with the principles of, and only two of them, humanity and impartiality. Neutrality is only mentioned marginally concerning medical personnel. Independence is not mentioned by international humanitarian law. But humanitarian organizations have adopted principles which include independence and neutrality, and at least Red Cross and Red Crescent movement and NGOs have also adopted some operational principles, like to respect local culture and customs, or to be accountable to the beneficiaries and to the donors, and to let beneficiaries participate in such principles. But now, where can humanitarian law help? Yes, it can remind us, one, that beneficiaries are at the center and not institutions. There's no violations of humanitarian law if one organization is hindered to have access, if another organization can do the job and does the job under humanitarian law. Then I have to remind you, also I'm very much shocked by the 200 people you mentioned, that humanitarians are not better protected than other civilians. And you know that how many more civilians. And I think it's important to remember this. There's a little exception with medical personnel, but to kill a humanitarian or to kill a civilian is a violation of humanitarian law, and there's no graduation. Perhaps you can morally say it's worse because you deprive then other people from humanitarian aid. There, I mentioned medical personnel. This is perhaps something which is outdated. The priority given by humanitarian, by law, to medical assistance, and the special rules concerning medical assistance. Under modern concepts of public health, I learned that it's more important to give people clean water than medicines or medical assistance. Nevertheless, so this may be a little outdated. Nevertheless, the big difference is that medical assistance may benefit to everyone, including fighters and combatants, while all other assistance may only benefit to civilians, and therefore, as a humanitarian organization, you have the difficulty that you have to check who benefits from your assistance, except if you deliver medical assistance. And finally, I should also mention two more things. Humanitarian law takes individual decisions into account, but not collective decisions. And therefore, this is an argument not to matronize or patronize too much the beneficiaries, but to really check. And I would add even the humanitarian staff. And finally, we have to admit, I didn't make humanitarian law, simply don't have illusions about humanitarian law. Humanitarian law also recognizes the legitimacy of security interests and of military necessity, and when there is a contradiction between this and the principle of humanity, then the proportionality principle becomes important. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So a lot of different aspects were again mentioned, complementing what we have heard this morning in the opening and what I mentioned in my introduction. And now the big question is, do we need to change or adapt the humanitarian principles for today's challenge? And this question goes to Andrea, and we don't expect you to answer to find this solution, but just to share a bit your ideas.
Maybe I even have the one. No, I'm sure everyone in the room knows that this is a question as old as the humanitarian principles are, if they are fit for purpose and if they should be adapted. I'm going to make 3 points. The first one is rather quick. You've mentioned it, Alexandra, in the beginning. Climate change, the climate crisis is one of the main challenges humans, and that includes humanitarians, are facing today. And part of my earlier research was finding out how can that adapt the principles. So just to walk you through in a second, and I'm sure Hugo will speak more to it tomorrow. because he's done more extensive research on it. But for example, should we expand the idea of humanity to groups beyond humanity? Should humanitarians adopt a One Health approach, for example? So that would be an adaptation of the humanitarian principles. Secondly, impartiality. You know, it's all over our discussions. There are decisions that are being made that shrink the budgets, so there's less resources and more need. Or should we do less with less? Should we do more with less? And how does that then relate to the principle of impartiality? And also, climate change is happening now, it has been happening, and it will be happening in the future. Do we include future needs into this equation of impartiality? And how difficult would be the equation then? Thirdly, independence. Obviously, humanitarian aid is largely financed by donor governments and private corporations, many of whom are involved in the burning of fossil fuel and the extraction of fossil fuel. So how can we maintain independence if the sector is financed by the ones who are causing the problem? Lastly, neutrality. One of my shticks is to address the temporal dimension also of humanitarianism. If we talk about climate justice, for example, I've made this point in several occasions. Should we not combine a thinking of the past of what the humanitarian sector, but also what Western donors have been involved in with a future of the humanitarian sphere, and if humanitarians would get more involved in the question of climate justice, how does that then relate to neutrality and staying out of those discussions? If you want to know more about that, there's a paper downstairs in the chair booth, but my main point that I would like to make is that of the principle tension between the flexibility and the dogmatism of the humanitarian principles. Thea Hillhorst, for example, has written about that. That the humanitarian principles are designed to leave a little bit of room for interpretation. So if every organization would attend to all the principles 100%, there would rarely any work be done. So I think the more important question then, should we drop certain humanitarian principles? Should we let loose of neutrality or independence because we cannot reach them anyhow? It's not the most important question, but the more important question is who is making those decisions? Who is making the decisions when to focus on neutrality, when to focus on independence? And this is way more important, I think, than working yourself through an adaptation of the principles. And this is connected to processes of decision making, and I would like to speak later about it in
Thanks
more
a
detail.
lot. Perfect. This is in fact our next question, the decision making, or the next block of questions. So as I said in the beginning, the dilemmas, it has so many different perspectives, angles and layers, and it's really complex. But nevertheless, we are here to do our work. We are humanitarians, we have humanitarian mandates. So it's sometimes as well about looking at us individually and at us as organizations, and to do this check-in, you know, how decision-making happens and how we are navigating the dilemmas. Is there room for proper reflection? Are we ready to learn from failure? And now I would like to somehow include or ask a question to our audience. And some of you might have heard about the Humanitarian podcast, the latest one from Michael Barnett and Lars Peter Nissen, where, and I quote, Barnett says, "The hardest thing in the world is to get a humanitarian to admit that they make a decision." So question to you, please raise your hand if you are a humanitarian expert, practitioner, manager, whatsoever, who is involved in making critical humanitarian decisions. That can be funding decisions, it can be proposal writing, it can be talking to your back donor. So please raise your hand if you are taking humanitarian decisions. So I would say half of our participants, it's a guess, are taking humanitarian decisions. There's a next question coming to the ones who raised their hand. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt the need to compromise on one of the humanitarian principles? Yeah, thanks a lot. I mean, I think it's really, really interesting to see that. And it somehow proves that we really have to talk about these dilemmas and how we navigate these dilemmas. And there we are with our next question, and I will always ask one question to two of our panelists, and the first one goes to Andrea and Sassòli, and it's about what is one concrete change you think humanitarian organizations should implement to better handle those dilemmas we face today. So one concrete change, and I would start maybe with Marco and then handing over to Andrea.
Well, I couldn't think about one, but some are...
Up to 3 are okay.
Okay.
Very short.
No. Obviously, the humanitarians have professionalized, and this is good, but they should not become technocrats. And then I think to give more weight to the informed choice of the individual victim, and also of staff. I give you a little example. When I was in Pakistan, my normal way when I'm in a country is to do what the people in the country do, and they look for cricket matches. And our security rules prohibited me to go to cricket matches because there's... and I think this is my informed choice that I take this risk, and I don't think an organization should prohibit me to take this risk because I'm an adult who can judge this risk. Then perhaps insist less on, because the access point is very important, and I agree, but think about perhaps a little more about results than about presence. Because I have a little suspicion that some humanitarians want to be present, to be on the TV for fundraising reasons and so on. One should really make an analysis. Do we need to be present to deliver results? And something very difficult for humanitarians is to admit that other humanitarians or others can do it better. And finally, obviously, there shouldn't be indifference towards violations of humanitarian law and human rights. Organizations have different mandates. Some organizations work confidentially, others make public statements. But I think it is essential that the people with whom we negotiate must not only hear that we want access, but also we must diplomatically, and I can give some examples for that, make the point that this conduct was contrary to humanitarian law or human rights.
Thanks a lot. And Andrea, can you maybe complement?
I'm sure I can. I would like to follow up on the process of decision making, and there I already said it because it's a process. I think when we look at decisions, we tend to look at the outcome of a decision, and we rarely, if we analyze that, we rarely take into account that a decision has a history and it has a future. So this is the first point I would like to raise, and from the point of now, what would be my advice to organizations and organizational cultures is, I'm willing to take offense here, but learn how to make decisions and make it in a structured way, an awareness of when and how principles play a role in your decision making. And at least I know that's not the case for all of the organizations that are present here, but some organizations I've been working with, there's the principles play a role when you sign your contract, when there's a press statement maybe, but in your everyday life, they don't come up so much. It depends on your level of intervention, if you're placed in Berlin or in some capital around the world. But still, the question of the principles being alive or being kind of a document that you signed is a very important one. Being very aware in the factors that influence their decision making on the principles, and especially with regard to who is involved in the process of decision making. What is with this area of discretion, Ermessensspielraum in Germany? Where a lot of those decisions are made in this kind of very blurry gray area, and it would be very helpful also for your legitimacy as humanitarian actors to shed a little bit of light on that. And to do that, I would propose that decision making should be part of your knowledge, of your everyday work, but also of your knowledge management and documentation. Rarely decisions are documented, and so we cannot connect a former decision to what's happening now or happening in the future. And this has something to do with the humanitarian sector being, in its way of working, very much focused on the present day, stuck in the present in a way. So decisions are not singular, but they are connected to each other. One decision that you made 5 years ago might still impact the way you can access certain areas, create dialogue, and even dissents within your team. Discuss those principles. Do they play a role, or do they not play a role? And be precise in language, because what we also found was that as there is so much room for interpretation, a lot of actors also here in the room might have different understandings of what neutrality means, what impartiality means, and so on and so forth. So always be precise about what you're talking about.
Thanks a lot. Very, very good and helpful points. It's basically the similar question. So looking ahead, what practical steps can we take? But I add here the individual level. So us as organizations, but us as individuals as well, in our roles, in our organizations, in our positions. How can we navigate these dilemmas more effectively and more ethically? And the question goes first to Abby and then to Nimo.
Thanks. I think whether you're an individual or an organization facing a humanitarian dilemma, there are two things that are important to keep in mind. The first is that there is no one correct or right answer. As Marco was saying, the principles are often in conflict with each other, as are short-term versus long-term consequences. So you need to remember that the definition of a dilemma is a choice between bad options. So your role is to pick the least worst option according to your assessment of the situation, of the people that you are serving, and of if you're an organization, your organization's objectives and needs. The second thing to remember is that not taking a decision is a decision. And that this is important for humanitarians because I think the very human response is to kick the can down the road and not engage with the dilemma, not make the decision. But that in itself is a default decision, which is probably not optimal and is certainly takes away from your agency. In terms of practical tools, I think organizations, like Andrea was saying, need a structured, deliberative process for having these conversations. My colleagues at Humanitarian Outcomes have developed something called the No Easy Choice framework and guide, which actually takes organizations and groups through a process of identifying the dilemma, identifying the values and principles at stake, looking at the different potential courses of action, and then using that information to then apply different ethical frameworks to it, not just the humanitarian principles, but other traditions and other ways of looking at the same problem, so that at least all viewpoints are being heard, and people are emotionally kind of detaching from the problem to discuss it. This grew out of research we did in Afghanistan, where after the Taliban reinstated the edict against employing women, organizations were wondering, well, do we comply with this and let go our female staff, or do we stop work and leave our beneficiaries in the lurch? Very few, no organization had any kind of guidance on how to deal with this, and so they would either defer on the decision and wait and see, try some workarounds, have their female staff working from home, or laid off temporarily, or they would have these very toxic and very counterproductive debates where people on all sides felt attacked for their own values, and that was terrible for morale. Having such a process would, it's not a consensus building tool. It doesn't tell you how to get to the answer. There's still one person making the decision. But at least everyone, no one's going to be happy with the final result, but they can be happier with the process, which is transparent. And like Andrea was saying, which is so important, is that it'll be documented, so that helps future decision making.
Thanks a lot. Nimo, can you please complement?
I will try. I think you've covered a lot of the issues that I was thinking about, but maybe one additional aspect is constantly having that conversation internally. I don't think principles, approaches is discussed internally as an organization, whether it's at the headquarter level, discussing with their country base, or whether it's internally the country base who is doing that. So reflecting that internally and having more conversations and training and awareness, I think, will improve the way we respond and make decisions as well. So I think that constant reference and conversation really needs to happen, not only at the conference level, but also at the organizational level. On the individual, I think we all have responsibilities, and as I said this morning, I think that plays a lot more role in what you can control and how you can deliver better. So leave the example that you want to do. Some situations are really difficult to apply all the principles, but maybe all are not applicable. I think you choose the one there is, and the one that could make the biggest impact, I think, biggest positive impact for the communities that we're serving. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Many different aspects again mentioned, and I would like, looking at the time and to give the audience the room for question and comments, I would like to come to our last question, which is about a clear call to action to policymakers and the global community. So to our panelists, imagine we have a big billboard in front of either the German parliament, the European Parliament, or the UN headquarters. What message would you put on it to advocate for improving the humanitarian system? And I would like to invite you to be as brief as possible. It can be a word, a sentence, an idea. Abby, do you want to start?
Make there be consequences. Have accountability.
Have accountability. Make there be consequences. Marco, what would be your?
I would say don't micromanage humanitarian action, both operationally and financially, and obviously what we all agree, don't mix legitimate political objective with purely humanitarian action, and don't oblige humanitarian players to fulfill your political objectives.
Thank you. Nimo, your idea, sentence.
Quickly, depoliticize humanitarian response, and I think live out the principles yourselves and don't expect others to do. I think we need to get away from this hypocrisy and the double standards.
Thanks a lot, Andrea.
I'm sorry, I have to make 2 or 3 sentences because I'm borrowing it from someone else, and I need to make that transparent. It's someone I have a huge crush on, the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, who has been mentioned already. She made a couple of very powerful statements at the General Assembly at the UN a couple of weeks back, and one was herself citing a proverb, a South African proverb, which is, I am because you are, I am because we are. And at the risk of sounding very naive and emotional in a room full of people, humanitarians can be quite cynical about their jobs. I think this is the most important thing that we have to remember, and that also combines us connects us to the world outside, because there's a huge world outside of the humanitarian bubble, and that would be kind of a message that my mother and my aunt and the people around us would also be able to relate to. So it's this I am because you are, and this is the basis of our common humanity, and that should be the basis of humanitarian action.
Thanks so much for very, very inspirational last sentences, ideas, sparks to somehow inspire our work. And now I would like to hand over to the audience here and the audience online for questions and comments. And so if you can please just mention your name or the organization you come from, and then please go ahead.
Yes. Carla Mkhail, I come from Lebanon, and I used to be a humanitarian in Lebanon for so many years, more than 15 years, heading IRC operation in southern of Lebanon. And my comment, I am, so we are, going to the Minister Bayerbog. She mentioned lately civilian objects lose their protected status when a member of Hamas or any other considered terrorist organization is among them. So if terrorists abuse this status, and I would like, and then Annabella Francesca, the UN expert, mentioned this is a strong status, and it's not with international humanitarian law. So I would like to address Professor Marco, asking about international humanitarian law and how does it contradict with international humanitarian law. What is the role of international organization, ICRC and other organizations who can do political lobbying or who can really make a statement, advocacy in this regard, speaking to politicians in Germany specifically now, because Germany has had a very strong opinion. Many people are dying just because one Hamas or one Hezbollah is among of these people. I lived in the south for 5 years. People wouldn't recognize who's Hezbollah and who's not. It's very enshrined in the communities. And you have 1 million people who are displaced, more than 1 million people are displaced, and people are fearing to rent others. So there is a risk of humanitarian crisis in Lebanon and a civil war caused by these statements. Again, I want to quote Abby, Mrs. Abby Stoddard. You said, not taking a decision is taking a decision. So not taking a stance is a stance already. I would like really to hear from Professor Marco, and what are the actions that could humanitarian actors do in Germany, how they can change the narrative. Thank you.
Well, what you described is wrong. There is no such rule. The opposite is true. There is a specific rule in Protocol Additional 2.1 saying that the fact that some non-civilians are among the civilian population does not make the civilian population lose its protection. There's a specific rule on that. And, but the problem is obviously the targets who are not civilians may still be targeted, but here the proportionality rule comes in, and I think this is a very important rule, but all the military, they don't want to clarify how they calculate exactly this proportionality, and the second problem is obviously that there is no transparency obligation in humanitarian law, unlike human rights law. And therefore, we don't know how important was this target that it could justify under the proportionality rule to put so many civilians at risk. And I simply cannot believe that there are so many so important targets that they can, just to speak about Gaza in such a densely populated area, you can be sure that you put many civilians at risk and that you will kill civilians if you target the, under humanitarian law, legitimate target. But now some humanitarian organizations speak out, others, like the International Committee of the Red Cross, say that bilaterally and confidentially. And I hope, I don't know, you don't know, we don't know, whether the ICSE also tells it, the German government, about its obligations as a state party to ensure respect and the consequences this has for German foreign policy and for delivery of weapons and so on.
Thanks a lot. And a lot of backdoor communications are happening. It's not only about the advocacy we all can see, but it's about often closed-door discussions. Yeah. Who else has a question or a comment? I can see here is, do you have the mic already?
Yes, thank you so much for the presentations. I'm Nasa Anadolian. I'm here as a part of the Network on Humanitarian Action Master's course, but I have also worked with Afghan refugee crisis in Iran for several years with UNHCR and the Norwegian Refugee Council. So back to your point on the differences between and different comprehensions on the deviations from the humanitarian principles. I would say that it's at the field level, this is somehow translated into different layers of interactions and partnerships and collaborations with power holders, authorities, service providers at some point. And in a context where there's a lot of humanitarian actors, this difference in tolerating different levels of deviations from humanitarian principles could be somehow perceived as not coherent action and differences that might set negative precedences at field level with these layers of interactions and partnerships. So my question is, how could we reduce the negative impacts of that? How could we navigate it in a way that, because at the end it could negatively impact the operation of some organizations if they are trying so hard to be harder to stick to humanitarian principles, to stay independent. How could this differences be navigated so that there would be a collective positive impact in a way? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Abby, do you want to answer? Or Andrea? Or Nimo?
I can answer just briefly that I think it's important for humanitarian organizations to have common red lines. I know they don't always work and people don't always stick to them, but having a common red line that everyone is agreed we should not cross can be helpful. I'm also encouraged by the access working groups. I think in some places they've made some progress. It depends on who's staffing them and a lot of other factors, but I think coordinated efforts towards expanding access show promise.
Thanks a lot. Somebody else wants to compliment? More questions, Philip.
Thank you. Philip with MSF. To a certain extent, the flip side of decision-making is error culture, right? So my question is, the humanitarian sector is famous for having really subpar error culture because it's fast-paced, high turnover, and you don't exactly win prizes with donors if you constantly talk about what you cannot do and how you're failing, et cetera, et cetera. So what can we do to improve error culture to make it an environment that we can actually learn? I mean, starting with recording our decisions, but then learning from wrong ones and also acknowledging what is a wrong decision in moment A can be in hindsight, be seen differently, but how can we become better at that and at learning from our mistakes?
Thanks a lot. Nimo or Andrea? Yeah, we can take the next question and then, yeah. good idea.
Well, hello, thank you for the intervention. My name is Caroline from the Network on Humanitarian Action. I have a specific question for Professor Sassòli. Nowadays, we witness new methods of warfare. We see different advancements in the terms of technology, disinformation, AI. And as we celebrate now the 75 years of the Geneva Conventions, for example, I would like to ask what specific reform in IHL would you like to see given these developments? And how do you see those reforms or changes making an impact in upholding these principles?
Thanks a lot for the question. This question was originally part of the panel discussion, and Marco said it's just too big as a question, but I think he can try to answer here. But I want to first come back to Philip's question on the error culture. So if Nimo or Andrea wants to...
I'll be quick. I think this is a very valid point, Philip. And the starting point is this practice of being more aware and being more meticulous in your internal reporting and awareness and within your team, because we've recently had a discussion and it turned out, or we came to the conclusion, if humanitarian organizations were private organizations and they fail so often, humanitarian organizations fail with what they want to do so often, and we all know that if they were private organizations, they would be off the market so quick, for not delivering what they are supposed to be doing. So we have this, project cycle where it's really important to state what you're doing in the beginning, to get the money, to get the funding, and then you do this or that, you act, and in the end you clean up when you have to, be accountable and report to your donor, basically, and then you are not talking about this, obviously, because you want the money again. So I think this is the first step to be, to be honest to yourself, and this is a practice. You have to. This is not something natural, but decision making is also not something natural. It's a practice, and we should be more aware of this, and then it sheds light on decisions that might have not been the best ones, or for various reasons end up in an outcome that we didn't want. And it also connects to a different level, and this is kind of, I think, maybe the bridge to what Nimo might be saying. When we talk about localization, the main question is, if international organizations trust their local partners to take the right decision, isn't it? And then, the right decision is the decision the international organization should have been taking, knowing that sometimes they also have not taken it. So, be as understanding with others as you are with yourself.
You said that eloquently, I won't repeat that one. I wasn't going to address it from the localization perspective, but maybe the nature of the humanitarian funding being short-term does not allow for that learning, but should it be short-term when we are looking at protracted crisis? What's the point of giving a 6-month funding to a place like Somalia, for example, because you've got protracted IDPs who've been there for the last however many years, new ones are coming in, you don't have a solution for the ones who are already there, and then now the nature of the funding is 6 months, 12 months, maybe the longest being 18 months. And do you really then have time to reflect? It's all about getting things out there. It's like a conveyor belt. You put it in, you get it out. And then the quality. So also that diminishes the quality of the response. So I think we need to be looking at the way humanitarians are funded as well, to allow organizations to learn, to have that conversation, to admit maybe where they've, at least internally, admit where they've not done it right. But this getting out, doing the check posts, I think this is the pressure that is on based on the funding and the way humanitarians funding. I think definitely that needs to be looked at, and we need to do more advocacy for that change.
The IHL question.
Yes, well, you know, we could have a conference about this, and there are conferences, and you could, on the website of the ICSE, find different meetings and discussions about this. Just in one sense, I would say there is reason for concern about new technologies. Most of them, in my view, can be tackled by the existing rules. You know, we are in Germany, we are in continental Europe, and we are so proud that we come from a civil law system. And the civil law system, the Code Napoleon had some principles, and then the judge applies them to cases. Now we don't have a judge because states and peoples do not want international judges deciding such things. Okay, but nevertheless, cyber, in my view, deserves its own regulation because it's not possible to apply the existing principles to something so delocalized. But on the other hand, where we are most concerned of, and I'm not so sure that today there are more violations of IHL than 50 years ago. This is an ahistoric, perspective. Think about the Spanish Civil War, the Carlist Wars in Spain, the colonial wars. Simply there was less information about these violations. Okay, but the violations we are so concerned about today are exactly the things the Geneva Conventions were made for. So we don't have to adapt anything in the substantive rules. Also, the rules on humanitarian assistance, and I'm sorry, I don't have a solution for that except proportionality, which is very vague. The weakness is that humanitarian assistance may only benefit to civilians. And in many situations, no organizations can guarantee that it will not also benefit to fighters. And what then survives is the proportionality principle. So if, which is not foreseen by IHL, if some of the fighters also get food or water or electricity and so on, then isn't it disproportionate to say, as we cannot avoid this risk and no one can avoid it, we stop the entire humanitarian assistance. So I think the rules on humanitarian assistance there, ideally we would need better rules, and again on transparency. But unfortunately, I have to tell you that all the military I have met in my life were obsessed by secrets. And all armed groups I met in my life were obsessed by secrets. So it's an uphill battle to say you must be more transparent, otherwise we cannot check whether you respect or you violate humanitarian law.
Thanks a lot. Are there more questions or comments? Here is one in front. And you? Okay, cool. So 2 questions.
Okay. Thank you. I'll try to be brief. Ulrike from formerly MSF. We haven't talked. First of all, thank you for the inspirational inputs. Lots to think about. And I have a question, an old question of mine. We haven't talked much about the principle of humanity and how it enters the equation. And so my old question is, occasionally MSF had to decide to leave a country, a project, a region, a commitment, and to say no. It was North Korea, and there were many other places, actually. And one of the famous ones was the situation in the camps in Goma after the genocide in Rwanda, where we observed a huge amount of corruption, etc. And no intervention by anyone international. So MSF decided to leave the camps under protest. they had gone up to the Security Council to complain, actually, so it was in the open. And at that moment, we were accused by some of the humanitarian partners of violating humanitarian principles, and especially the principle of humanity. So the question is, how long and to what extent should we feel obliged to be there if we basically, technically, financially can, but may actually encounter other obstacles? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can you please, Ulrike, pass the mic to...
Thank you very much. This is Wafa from MDM. I want to comment on the point of making decisions and compromise sometimes in the decisions. I work for MDM, and I have been a head of mission almost 8 years now in different countries. And I raised my hand when you said, did you feel that you compromised? I think, yes, with the humanitarian principles, with the complexities in the field, we do that. Sometimes we compromise, even intentionally or not intentionally, but we have done it collectively or individually. Sometimes we cannot judge our decisions, but I think as long as we are still driven by the humanitarian principles and we judge ourselves against the humanitarian principles, we do our best. We make our best guess in a certain situation, still okay. I think what we need to be careful about, and please correct me if I make mistakes in that, is not to be driven by the growth, by our operational capacity, by saying, okay, if we don't accept this funding or if we don't apply for this emergency, we will be smaller next year. And this is our identity, this is our brand. I think this is the thing that we need to be more careful about. As long as we are driven by the humanitarian principles, we do our best. But the moment we step in the area of, okay, we want to maintain a big operational capacity, offices, staff, everything, otherwise we cannot respond, I am not sure. I think stepping in that space makes us more closer to corporates rather than to humanitarian actors. And please correct me from your studies, from everything. It's this conscious that I try to keep, and maybe I'm mistaken. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. I don't think you're mistaken, but I would like to pass the two questions, the one on the principle of humanity and your very valid comment to one of our panelists who feels like Nimo.
I will leave others to discuss the humanity bit, but maybe just on this one, it's a valid way of thinking, and actually a lot of the big organizations do that, and this is why the focus and the mandate has just been expanding on international organizations. The need to be present, the need to be visible, the need to do this, the need to expand. And I think that is also rewarded within the system. How much funding you bring in as a country director or as a region director, it's sense of a reward to you. But the flip side would be, then how do we want to localize and provide a better equitable partnerships to our local partners to sustain and build those relationships in country if and when others have to leave, is by looking at the footprint of your organization, right? And it has to be, how do you see the incentive in doing that though? Is it, and this is coming back to having the communities at the heart of the response, is that it's not about you as an organization expanding, it's not about your footprint, even though those local partners can provide employment, because people, you know, when you localize and when you promote localization, you sort of kind of asking organizations to downsize, which means people will lose their jobs. But I'm sure those local NGOs will need the technical expertise that are not available. I remember having a conversation with somebody, I don't remember, one of these many conferences that I attend, and where they are providing the funding directly to the local partners, and the local partners are deciding which international partner to partner with, so that the decision is flipped in a sense. So it's the locals and the localities who are given the platform to decide and then to partner with who they want to partner. So maybe that would be an example that could be learnt from. But I don't think it means if we're putting the communities in the heart of the response, in the center, then I think we will use whatever strategies we need to use to support them, to enable them to better support themselves. So I think, yeah, so I definitely agree with that notion.
Thanks a lot. Abby, do you want to answer the humanity question?
Yeah, just to say first that I completely agree with Nimo, and I think that's a really interesting idea. And I've always also thought that an international organization that is passing through its funding to a national or local organization needs to show how it adds value and why that organization shouldn't just receive it directly. And I think they do, and sometimes add economies of scale and things like that, but they're not required to show that, and I think they should. So the humanity one is tricky. I think what you described was the definition of a dilemma, I think, because humanity is one of the principles that can be in conflict with other principles.
And you said it's a dilemma between complicity and coverage. Did I remember that right? Which is also applicable here.
Right. So do we stay and be complicit, or do we leave? And that's, yeah, that's it. And I don't think there's no right answer, and organizations need to decide. Now, I've noticed when MSF does make a decision to leave, it does it in an interesting way. It's very public. It uses it as an advocacy point. And there are often other NGOs that it can hand over to so that they're beneficiaries. So I think that's sometimes either other MSFs. So in a way, that's a good way to do it. But it's always going to be wrenching and difficult, and no one's going to feel great.
May I say something? Your remark is part of what I would think is the answer to your dilemma. As long as it is about the interest of the beneficiaries, also I personally would say on the long run we are all dead, so it must be relatively short-term interests. To say, let's have these people dying because in 10 years the situation will then be better is typically not an argument of a humanitarian. But she gave an important point, which is, and here I have a suspicion and don't think this suspicion is mainly a suspicion of about my former employer also. He is also covered that sometimes it's institutional interest and not genuine humanitarian dilemma to say what is best for the victims, but exactly what you described. And this, we must say, this may not be included, although I must tell you, because I experienced that some would then argue, look, it's in the interest of the victims that we have a critical mass, because then we can intervene when suddenly a conflict breaks out in Mongolia, and if we are for $2 billion organization, we can do that, while if we are smaller, we can no longer do this. But this, again, is, in my view, on the long run, we're all dead argument. So I would stay with more limited humanitarian dilemmas, but it's typically a dilemma. I admired MSF that it did what it did in this context.
Time is over, but there is a reception, that's the good news. So I really invite you to continue discussing over the reception. As this morning, the opening, it's complex. There are so many different perspectives that we cannot find an answer, but I really think it's good to have this open, transparent discussions, and I really hope that you take some new inputs with you into your daily work. I certainly learned a lot, and I would like to thank our panelists. They were really great panelists with bringing all their expertise here to Berlin to the Humanitarian Congress. And tomorrow, don't forget, it starts at 9 o'clock with a great opening again. Applause.